So you've got this picture in your head of hiking the snowy mountains, or maybe catching a sunset across the horizon. But what really happens is you end up with zero sleep, shivering with cold, and waking up in a puddle of water. So my name's Paul, and in this video I've got 6 tips to help new wild campers and backpackers to try and avoid some of the common mistakes that are made when out wild camping. So the first mistake that new wild campers make is they take far too much gear with them. They might buy a 70, 80 or even 100 litre pack and then cram it to the rafters with things that they might need just in case. For an overnight trip they might take 3 changes of clothes, 4 pots and pans for cooking dinner, and even throw in the kitchen sink. And trust me, you really don't need all that gear. If you buy a big backpack, the natural thing to do is just cram it full of stuff because you've got the space for it. But I think it's a better idea to first buy your shelter, your sleeping kit, and that should account for around 2/3 to a half of the capacity of your rucksack. So if your tent and all your sleeping gear takes up 30 litres of capacity, then you should manage just fine with a 50 to 60 litre pack. So mistake number 2 is pitching your tent in the wrong place. And with all the winds we've had lately, it's not ideal pitching next to a tree like this. Always check above you for what they call widow makers. The last thing that you want is a big branch flattening your tent in the middle of the night. So don't pitch your tent on the banks of a popular reservoir or a few hundred yards from a farmhouse, because the chances are that you're going to get moved on by a ranger or an angry farmer. Find somewhere well off the path and quite remote, and that way no one's going to bother you. This might sound obvious, but don't pitch your tent on an incline. Even the slightest of gradients can mean that you end up sliding down into a pile at the bottom of your tent. Make sure there's no big holes, rocks or anything sharp underneath where you're going to be pitching your tent. Try and avoid boggy ground as well. It's no fun at all waking up in a puddle of water. And although you've seen me do it lots of times, I don't recommend pitching your tent on an exposed summit. Those areas can get really windy and you could end up with a damaged tent or spending the night holding onto your tent poles and getting no sleep. You can get away with it if you've got a specialist expedition tent that is made for those kind of conditions, or you can guarantee that there's going to be no wind. So mistake number 3 that new campers make is not fully understanding how their sleep system works. Not all sleeping bags and sleeping pads are made equal. Sleeping bags have different temperature ratings, and the pad isn't just there to keep you comfortable from the hard ground. Most sleeping bags have 3 different temperature ratings. They have a comfort rating, a limit rating and an extreme rating. The comfort rating is the only thing that you really need to pay attention to. If the temperature you're going to be sleeping in doesn't fall below this comfort rating, you should have a decent night's sleep. But bear in mind, everyone sleeps differently, so you may feel the cold a little bit or you may be too warm. And it's much easier to stick an arm or a leg out if you're a little bit warm than it is to try and warm up if your bag's not up to the job. But the sleeping bag is only half of the story. So this one has got a comfort rating of -3 degrees, but the insulation on the back of the sleeping pad gets squashed, so that offers you no protection really from the ground. And that is where your sleeping pad comes into play. Although this sleeping pad is really comfortable, it's got no insulation inside of it. So if I was to sleep at 0 degrees with this system, the cold ground would chill the air inside this pad and I'd get cold from underneath, and that would mean a miserable night's camping. But the good news is you can get sleeping pads that are insulated, and a bit like the comfort rating on a sleeping bag, sleeping pads, they have something called an R value. So basically the higher the R value of the pad, the more insulation it has, so therefore you can sleep in colder temperatures. So although this pad doesn't have any insulation, the manufacturer does claim that it has an R value of 1.6 and comfortable down to 2 degrees Celsius. So before I move on, a massive thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. If you don't know who Squarespace are, they make it really easy for people like you and me to create a website of our own. We've been using the Squarespace platform for our website for a couple of years, and this week we've used it to add a couple of new products. It's really easy to add photos, whatever text you want, sizes, prices, all that kind of thing. Checkout system and the order processing all runs in the background. All we got to do is post things. If I can set up a website, you definitely can. And it doesn't have to be a shop, there's templates for literally anything. Photographers can create a portfolio, vloggers can share their videos, even your nan can set up a homemade knitted jumper shop. Pretty much anything that you'd like a website for. So if you want a free trial, then click this link in the description below or head over to squarespace.com/Paul Messner and you'll also get 10% off your first purchase. Which brings me nicely on to mistake number 4, which new campers, and a few old ones too, that get sucked in by the hype when it comes to camping gear. We sometimes get sucked in and believe everything that manufacturers say when it comes to temperature ratings, how waterproof or breathable that a product is. But fear not, there are some standards in place. So this sleeping bag is EN rated. which means that the product has been made to a standard and it's also been tested, so it should do what it says on the tin. So this bag should keep you comfortable to -3 degrees, but as I said earlier, we do all sleep a little bit differently, so we've got to take that with a little pinch of salt. There is also an approved standard for sleeping pads. That particular standard is an ASTM R value. Most of the leading manufacturers like Thermarest, Cedar Summit, they produce sleeping pads to within this standard, so you can pretty much guarantee that the R value that they state is the R value that you're going to get. So some of the cheaper pads like this Trekology don't have an ASTM R value. This means that the pad hasn't been tested to approved standards, and the R value that they've given this pad has probably been plucked from thin air. So there's no law that says that any manufacturer has to have these EN ratings or the ASTMR values. And I've tested this pad in different temperatures, and it definitely does not keep you comfortable at 2 degrees. So be really careful when it comes to buying sleeping bags and sleeping pads, because unless they are manufactured to an approved standard, then more than likely the temperature rating that they're claiming is going to be inaccurate. So don't forget, for a comfortable night's sleep, both your pad and your bag should be rated for the temperatures that you're camping in. So mistake number 5 is not preparing properly before you go camping. You are better off having a checklist for when you're packing your backpack. It's very easy to forget things when you're camping. I still regularly forget little things like a spoon or the skillet when I've got bacon to fry, which doesn't matter so much, but if you forget your sleeping bag or your tent poles, that will definitely ruin your trip. Also, if you've never been camping before, I highly recommend that you have a go at pitching your tent before you head up into the hills. That way you can check that there's no pieces missing and you know how to pitch it. You don't want to be pitching it for the first time in the dark or in windy conditions. Get to know your gear and how to set it up. You also need to regularly check the weather forecast. So that is before you go and while you're on your trip if you can. So don't go off the forecast on the BBC. You're better off using a dedicated hill or mountain weather forecast. The conditions up in the hills and mountains are definitely going to be different to what they are in the cities and towns. Pay close attention to the wind speeds and if there's going to be any snow and ice, because you may need extra gear or take precautions when pitching your tent. So getting caught out in bad conditions is one thing, but don't deliberately head out camping if you know the weather's going to be stormy. Camping in those conditions, you're going to need some specialist kit and you really need to know what you're doing. Another important part of the plan is picking your route and navigation. It's really important that you learn to read maps properly, because what you might think is a footpath could be Striding Edge or Crib Goch. And you really don't want to be stuck on a ridge waiting for mountain rescue. We're not in the dark ages, so most of my navigation nowadays is from my phone. But apps crash, batteries die, and you can't always get a signal, so it's really important that you learn how to use a map and compass and take those with you as backup. So the last mistake in this video that new wild campers often make is not wearing suitable clothing for their trip. When you're just starting out, dedicated hiking gear can be quite expensive, but you shouldn't be heading out in jeans and flip-flops. So jeans, when they get wet, are very heavy and difficult to dry. In fact, cotton is pretty much a no-no when it comes to heading out in the hills. It doesn't wick away the moisture and you'll get cold really quickly. And let me tell you, hypothermia is no fun at all. Anybody has got a puffer jacket these days, and I see quite a lot of people hiking up in their down jackets. And when you're active, you're going to get a little bit sweaty, and it's not a good idea to get your down insulation wet. Save the down jacket for when you're hanging around camp and you're not doing anything too active, and that way you'll stay nice and warm. Something that I really struggle with when I'm hiking is sweating. Ideally, you want to avoid that as much as possible. You can do that by lowering the activity level, so slow down a little bit, or by venting or removing layers of clothing. So a lot of the mainstream clothing systems are based on layering, so you may have some kind of thin wicking base layer, then a mid-layer fleece, and then a windproof coat or a hard shell for keeping the rain out on top. And just add or remove some of those items to regulate your temperature. So I've recently swapped over to the Buffalo system, which is just a single layer, so I can keep one garment on all day and I haven't got to switch lots of different layers out. It regulates your temperature differently, but that's for another video. You do need some kind of waterproofs for when you go camping though. You want to try and avoid being cold and wet as much as possible. But if you do get wet, when you set up camp, get in your tent, don't sit about in all that wet gear, make sure you've got something dry to get changed into. So if you want to find out what gear you really need to go camping, then check out this video here. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.